Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's special 90-minute webinar, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speakers. We'll be breaking for discussion several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. If you run into technical problems, you can request help in the box labeled Type Here for Technical Help. Someone will contact you directly to help solve your problem. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. If you missed part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available on the NCCPS Webinars page in about a week, and watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for today's presentation. As regulations and lawsuits alter the Title IX landscape, it can be challenging for Title IX coordinators to keep up. Nevertheless, one thing remains constant. Colleges and universities should do everything they can to protect their communities with both a fair investigation process and vibrant prevention education. Among other topics, today we'll hear about trauma-informed Title IX investigations, critical community partnerships, and coordinating Title IX training efforts on your campus. We're welcoming 3 Title IX experts to cover this crucial material. Chantelle Cleary is Director for Institutional Equity and Title IX Coordinator at Cornell, where she's responsible for overseeing the university's responses to unlawful discrimination and sexual and related misconduct. Scott Schneider is a partner with Hush Blackwell LLP, assisting educational institutions across the country with complex legal issues, including particularly sensitive matters such as institutional response to sexual assault. And Sam Wilmoth, Title IX Education Specialist at West Virginia University, focuses on service coordination and secondary prevention and provides training on Title IX issues to WVU faculty, staff, and students. Chantelle, Scott, and Sam, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online. Sam, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I know I speak for both of my co-presenters when I say that we're delighted to see you all here. And I just think it's helpful to begin with a kind of bird's eye view of where we are. And I fully expect that it is that bird's eye view that has brought many of you here. We have an environment that I think is, has a lot of uncertainty in it right now. One source of that uncertainty is that we are awaiting new regulations that could change the way we do our jobs as Title IX administrators, as I assume many in the audience are. But the other source of uncertainty, or maybe even a little anxiety, comes from the laser-like focus that the broader society has on our work. And what I want to suggest is that that is evidence that we're trying to do something important, that in working really hard to come up with a fair process to serve people who have had terrible experiences that no one should ever have. We're standing in the teeth of one of the most important moral issues of our time. And I think it is worth stepping back and trying at every conceivable opportunity to improve the way we do what we do, but also to validate the progress we've already made. Now, as we start to talk about new regulations or developing case law, I think one broad frame of reference is really useful here, which is that so much of adjusting or avoiding over-adjusting to these changes means really trying to recognize the difference between a regulatory floor and the ceiling of what we can do well. And so I hope at various points throughout this presentation we'll be thinking about compliance, sure. But we'll also be thinking broadly about what are the things our offices can do better, including, by the way, working with allied professionals. And I'm sure there are a number of them in the room, so to speak, with us now, whether this is community-based advocates or system-based advocates, whether it's police officers or other university administrators, or attorneys. So we will be talking about what we expect the changes will be in the near future, but we also need to acknowledge the present, which unfortunately still contains not only unacceptably high levels of violence in this culture, not that there would ever be an acceptable level of it, but also really low rates of reporting. And I acknowledge that in Title IX, it might not feel this way because many of us have experienced a groundswell of people seeking help from various university departments. So much so, in fact, that some of you may be overwhelmed. Some of you may need to gather data about who's using your services so you can advocate for more resources in your offices. But it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg in Title IX. A very small fraction of survivors of violence end up seeking help, and that means that even in systems where we have a victim advocate who is anonymous or confidential, we're probably still only seeing a little bit of a much larger phenomenon. So one thing that I use when I'm teaching to illustrate this, this cultural issue that we have here is that I often ask my students or staff or faculty members to engage in a kind of informal exercise. And it's a difficult one, I should warn you. If you want to get a sense of what the state of the culture is on these issues, I think it's useful to go online and find a news article about sexual violence or intimate partner violence. And once you found that news article on virtually any website, scroll to the bottom and for just a few minutes, read the comments. What you will see in that 3, 4, 5-minute exercise are many of the cultural forces that make our work so difficult. And I often think to folks who haven't thought about these issues really closely, that is an exercise that illustrates some pretty basic questions about things like delayed reporting or why people might be hesitant to talk about having ever been involved with Title IX in the first place. But it's not enough to have a broad bird's eye view of this. I also want to make sure we're getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of what it means to do a good trauma-informed investigation. And so in the next section here, we're going to talk about just that.
Okay, folks. So hi, everyone. So honored to be here and to be able to speak with you all about conducting trauma-informed investigations in this landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles of a trauma-informed investigation, but what I want to start with is just a recognition of, I think, the anticipation and perhaps anxiety that those of us who are doing this work, particularly in higher education, are feeling right now with the uncertainty surrounding the proposed regulations. What I can say, though, is that what we can remain certain about and what will be unchanging is that in doing the work that we do, we can continue to engage in a process and provide the folks that we're serving a process that recognizes not only the impact of trauma, but also just the stress that's caused by sharing an experience of violence or going through a process in which you've been accused of engaging in some form of sexual or related misconduct or sexual or interpersonal violence. And so when we receive reports of sexual or related misconduct, we can always engage the folks in a way that recognizes the difficulties that they're facing. And so I don't know that much will change with respect to how we engage with our communities, particularly when we're conducting our investigations. So the principles of a trauma-informed investigation I will go over briefly and give you just a general overview. One of the most important principles of conducting a trauma-informed investigation is having folks who are properly educated in conducting investigations of this nature. We also want to make sure that when we receive a report of sexual or related misconduct, our initial outreach to the person who's had the experience is both thoughtful and deliberate. We want to make sure we're engaging in a support client-centered intake, not only of the person who's experienced or is reporting that they've experienced some form of violence, but also our first meeting with accused folks, whether that's accused members of our student body, our faculty, or our staff, must also really focus on ensuring that that person, the respondent, the accused, whatever the language is that you're using at your institution, is being supported and offered the same services that are being offered to folks who are reporting violence. We also want to conduct our interviews of these folks in a way that recognizes both the impact of trauma, but also recognizes that our interviews can sometimes re-traumatize or cause secondary trauma, and so we want to be mindful of that in the way that we conduct our interviews. And then finally, we want to make sure that our follow-up with individuals is centered on supporting them in the aftermath of their engagement with us. So it's really important that the folks doing this work have an understanding of how trauma may affect a person's response to violence, their memory, right? So particularly their ability to recall their experience, as well as their ability to recount their experience. And so when folks are doing this work, we want to make sure that that they have been given the resources and training and education that is necessary to understand how a traumatic experience, or including an experience with violence, may affect their disclosure. There are a number of amazing resources out there that can provide folks with this understanding, resources that are free of charge. So Valley and Violence Against Women International has an excellent website that has a ton of free resources for folks to tap into that will go over the basic principles of conducting trauma-informed investigations and interviews. There are also other opportunities for training and education for folks to engage in, and so it's really important that if you have a staff of investigators, or if you yourself are doing these investigations on your campuses, that you're ensuring that the investigators have the knowledge and the education that's necessary to conduct these investigations in an appropriate manner. It's also important if you are at an institution that is utilizing outside investigators, so you're either contracting out with different organizations to do the work for you, that you're making sure that they have a basic understanding of conducting trauma-informed investigations. Upon receipt of a report of sexual or related misconduct, it's important that we are mindful of how we initially engage with the person who is reported to have had the experience, whether they've reported themselves or we've received the report third party, or from a person at the institution who has a duty to report the information. And so one of the things that folks should be considering prior to engaging with a person who's experienced violence is the timing of the initial outreach. So how are we going to, and when are we going to reach out to that person is very important. For example, we want to be considerate of, in a case, let's say, of dating violence. If your institution generally reaches out to folks via email, right? One of the questions we need to be asking ourselves is it safe to send an email? Right? In a case involving dating violence, we want to consider whether or not perhaps the person who's engaging in the violence may have access to the email accounts or other accounts by which we might communicate with a student. And we want to make sure that nobody else has access to those accounts, because as we know, we don't want to create further risk to that person if the person engaging in the conduct learns that a report has been made. So when determining how you're going to engage in that initial outreach, it's really, really important to be planful and strategic. My recommendation is, if available to you, to work with other folks who may be able to assist in the outreach. So if, for example, you receive a report from a resident assistant or from somebody in the residential space about misconduct that's occurring within the residence hall. If that, let's say, resident assistant has a relationship with the person who made the report, you may ask them to make that connection. That way you're ensured that the connection is being made safely. We also want to be mindful about how often we reach out to a person who we believe may have experienced violence. So if, for example, you do that initial outreach and you don't get a response, thinking about how many other times we reach back out and the ways in which we reach back out. So if, for example, you reach out via email in the first instance and you don't get a response, you want to perhaps follow up, but every case is different, and so you have to be evaluating that on a case-by-case basis. After making contact with the person who has that's been reported to have experienced violence, if they are willing to come in and speak with you or a member of your staff, it's really important that first meeting focus mostly on creating a sense of safety, right? And this is one of the most basic tenets of a trauma-informed response to sexual or related misconduct. At the initial meeting, your job as a person doing this work is to create a sense of safety and to provide information to the person that will empower them to make the decisions that are right for them. So we want to provide them information about support, resources, and options for reporting. If you're meeting with the person face-to-face, it's really important that you're meeting in a place that feels safe to them, that you're giving them the options about where they want to meet, where even something as simple as where in a room they'd like to sit. All of those gestures tell the person that they're in control and that your primary goal is to make sure that they feel safe and that they are safe moving forward. If after that initial communication with either a complainant, well, in this case, a complainant or a person who's reported having experienced violence, they do opt to move forward and engage in an investigatory process or file a complaint through the university system, you will move on to conducting a trauma-informed investigative interview. When conducting a trauma-informed investigative interview, your primary goal is to, or objective, is to capture the entire experience of the person whom you're interviewing. What you're going to want to do is start with an overview, a transparent overview of the interview process. Let the person know what the interview is going to be like. So what I might often do is sit down with the person and I'll say to them, at this time, I'd like to get an understanding of your experience, and in a few moments I'm going to ask if you're willing to share your experience with me. And I tell them that I'm going to just listen. I let them know that once they start talking, I'm going to stop talking and I'm not going to talk again until they've told me that they have finished sharing their experience with me. This lets them know that I'm comfortable with periods of silence. That it gives them permission to engage in some silence and to be reflective as they're sharing. It also gives them permission to ask questions and to go at their own pace. It lets them know that I'm there to listen to them and that it's important for me to have a full understanding of their experience to the extent that they're able to share it. Then I allow them to do just what I've explained, which is to share their experience in the narrative. Once they've completed sharing their experience in the narrative, it's only at that point that I'll go back and interview for clarification. When interviewing for clarification, I'm utilizing questions that recognize the potential impact of trauma. So, for example, when I'm asking somebody or I'm seeking more detail on a particular point, I will ask them if they're able to share more about that point. Using the term able triggers to them that I understand that there may be certain things about their experience that they're not able to share in that moment. And so it's another method of providing a safe space for that person to disclose their experience. It's important to note that when engaging with a person who's reporting having experienced violence, it's really important to ask questions that recognize the impact of trauma. But the methodology used and the manner in which we question a person who's reporting having experienced violence can be used and should be used when interviewing folks who are accused of engaging in violence as well. Another question that you might, or another way of framing questions that you have when interviewing for clarification is asking folks to help you understand certain aspects of their disclosure. So for example, saying, help me understand the position of your body if you're able to during this particular part of your experience. Also asking questions that are focused on the sensory experience, so asking people what they are able to tell you about what they felt physically during their experience, what they smelled during their experience, what they saw during their experience. All of questions framed in this way are intended at assisting a person who may have had a traumatic experience in being able to fully share to the extent that they're able with you. At the conclusion of an investigative interview, you do want to set expectations about next steps. Again, this is about making sure that the person who has been interviewed feels as if they are in control of the situation. It allows them to understand what they should expect as next steps. And it also allows them to ask questions at that point. And so it's really important to conclude not only with setting expectations, but inviting folks to be able to ask questions about next steps. At the conclusion of a investigative interview with either a person who's reported having experienced violence or a person who is accused of engaging, you do want to stay in touch. Sometimes our investigations, as we all know, can span over the course of a very lengthy period of time, and so it's really important that we are staying connected with the students that we're working with or the folks that we're working with as the investigation continues. Going weeks or months without any contact is not ideal and not best practice. And so you want to keep folks informed. And at the conclusion of that initial interview, you may ask them how they like to be kept informed. So a question that I often ask at the conclusion of an interview is, moving forward, there are going to be some steps, like how often would you like me to check in with you? So we may ask questions like that. Again, it's another way of empowering the folks to have some control over the next phase of the process. You also want to continue to offer support and resources both at the conclusion of your interview and then also in your follow-up communications with folks. And you want to let them know that you're available to them to make connections, support, and resources at any point moving forward. Finally, when you're sharing information that you've learned with the parties, you want to be thoughtful and deliberate about the potential impact that that information may have on the folks that you're working with, and you want to be mindful about the method of delivery. So, for example, if at the conclusion of an investigation process you're sharing the outcome, you want to be thoughtful and deliberate about how you share that outcome, when you share that outcome. Sharing an outcome or a decision of a panel or an investigation Friday at 4 p.m. Is not the ideal time to share a decision, right? Because then we're going into a weekend and perhaps students may not have access to support and resources that they would have had access to in the middle of the week. But again, talking to the students and the faculty and staff that we work with in advance to ask them how they might want to receive the information and what is the most comfortable way for them to receive it is something to consider if your procedures and policies allow for that kind of method of sharing information. Okay, so that's just our broad overview of conducting a trauma-informed interview, and I will turn it over to Scott.
Well, first, Chantelle, we're going to have some questions. You've come to Campus Public Safety. That's okay. Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Today we're hearing about remaining trauma-informed in an era of changing Title IX regulations. You've just heard Chantelle Cleary. In a couple minutes, we're going to hear from Scott Schneider and later from Sam Wilmoth. You heard from Sam earlier, actually. But in the meantime, we've got questions for Chantelle. Keep those questions coming into the chat room. We'll be stopping for questions several times during the session. Chantelle, Keith Berry wonders, in an initial report situation, we encourage the complainant to handwrite a statement without us asking any questions. Would this be considered an acceptable practice?
So I think what I'll start by saying is that the most important thing to do is to follow the policies and procedures of the institution at which you're working. And so if your policies and procedures require having a person handwrite a statement, then you have to follow those policies and procedures. But if you don't have a requirement that a person handwrite their statement, then I think that it's an acceptable practice. It's not one that I see often, but I think that it is an acceptable practice. But I would encourage folks to have a conversation with students. So ask them how, if they're willing to share their experience or if they're able to share their experience, and then asking them how they'd like to share their experience. So if a student wants to write down what they're able to recall and what they're able to share, then I don't think that we should prohibit them from doing
that. Scott or Sam, would you like to weigh in on that?
This is Sam. I just wanted to add one thing, which is that we want to make sure too that whatever way we do this isn't necessarily too rigid, if for no other reason than because of accessibility, right? So we may have some students for whom doing a written statement is, less of a good option. I would just say, as somebody who really prioritizes, building rapport with a person that I'm talking with, I wouldn't personally be a big fan of the written statement as kind of the first step. I also think that it can be really difficult for people in some cases to just formulate a really clear chronology of something that happened without kind of talking through it first. I know many institutions are recording interviews, and there's a pretty spirited discussion about the costs and benefits of that, of recording and then perhaps paying to transcribe them. But I do think there is something about a skilled interviewer helping someone feel comfortable to talk about a difficult issue that is really tough to replace. And I would worry a little bit about the loss of that trust building if someone just fills out a written statement at first.
Yeah, I think
I
Scott?
agree entirely with that.
Yeah, I agree with both Chantelle and Sam. Obviously, from a legal perspective, whatever our policy is, we need to follow that meticulously. And if the policy says the initial contact with a complainant or a respondent or both is through some sort of written statement that they submit, I mean, certainly we want to follow that. For all the reasons I think, though, that Sam articulated and Chantelle as well, it's not my favorite approach. And certainly if the alternative is someone isn't comfortable with us and this is the method that they feel most comfortable with communicating what happened to them initially, then certainly to the extent our policies allow it and we're being equitable, I don't have a problem with it, but it's not my favorite practice.
Let me squeeze in one more question during this break. Don't worry, we won't lose them. Mark Thelsheim wonders how much consideration should be given to the gender of the interviewer. Chantelle?
So I don't mean to kind of go off track, but I see that I wanted to do some follow-up to the previous question. So Keith had responded that they do a follow-up interview by a trained investigator to allow for an expansion of the initial written statement. So Keith, thank you for adding that. And I just want to follow up with that. And so if that is the practice, if there's going to be a follow-up, I think I would be more disinclined to do the written statement in the first place. So I agree entirely with Sam and Scott. And I would take it a step further. If you're going to have a conversation with the person who's reporting an experience of violence, then you should have the conversation. You know, I encourage you all to think about just engaging with people generally. These are folks who are coming to you. They're sharing something that is very likely difficult to share. And so having that human connection as they're sharing, being able to look the interviewer, right, the interviewee being able to look the interviewer in their face and see the reaction and see if we're doing this right, the warmth, right, that we're kind of exuding and you know, I think that's really important to creating that safe space. And so I just wanted to follow up with that. Turning to the other question.
So first, Keith, thanks for following up there, and Chantelle, thanks for picking up on that. But in the interest of sticking with our timeline, we will not lose Mark Felsheim's question. We've got a couple more breaks scheduled, but for now, I'm going to turn the floor over to Scott.
I have the floor. It's so good to be with you all today and with two of the people I just have so much respect for and love and all that sort of stuff. I'll stop all the mushy stuff now. So we're 47 years into Title IX at this point, and I think it's almost a cliche, but it's a cliche with some historical underpinnings that we see these fairly wide and significant fluctuations with respect to enforcement of Title IX depending on the political party of the administration that's in power. And by the way, this isn't just a recent phenomenon. This is an integral part of the history of this law, and it's played itself out in a number of different ways. It's also one of the few, I mean, I do all sorts of higher ed law, but it's probably the only law, Title IX is probably the only higher ed law that really gets the attention of what I call the culture warriors on both sides, certainly in a way that FERPA or the borrower defense regulations do. And those folks are now political ideologues and public intellectuals that take an interest in all of these issues and frankly have influence, sometimes very outsized influence in administrations over how we set policy in this country, and are oftentimes, I think, those political ideologues a lot better at generating heat and I guess the attendant clicks that come with that than light. And so you sort of see this.
Scott, can I let me interrupt you for a minute. We've got a couple of people who are having trouble hearing you, so if you have any way of moving the microphone closer to your mouth or perhaps speaking up, for whatever reason, your voice apparently is not carrying as well over the net as Chantelle's and mine.
Is this better?
I think it sounds better to me. Why don't you go ahead and we'll see what the audience says. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I'm right on the mic, so I'll start screaming a little bit. So long story short,
everybody's saying it's better. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. So what I was saying is, look, Title IX is just one of these areas where political ideologues, and this is throughout the history of Title IX, have taken an interest in this law unlike any other higher education law, certainly more than FERPA or the borrower defense rules. And what you've seen, I think, is, at least in the public sphere about Title IX and trauma-informed investigations, is the sort of public ideological critiques of campuses and their uses of these practices, which, at least in my opinion, and you see this in this Chronicle article, typically begins with the creation of a straw man. That is, that trauma-informed practices promote the view that if a complainant provides an inconsistent account of what happened to him or her in a Title IX process, that inconsistency is evidence of an underlying assault. And so we see this. There was an article just recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it was the revolt of the feminist law professors, and there was this line that really stuck out to me. It was kind of a throwaway line. It was likely, for instance, to promote, and this is talking about colleges, the practices of so-called trauma-informed investigation, which proceeds on the assumption that inconsistent or confused victim recollections reflect the traumatic effects of assault and are themselves evidence of the truth of the accusation. And it is that little last part that we see a lot of folks, ideologues in this space, suggesting is what trauma-informed investigating is really all about. And I think that's clearly wrong. And when I thought that was just an accident, there was a piece that was done as well by Emily Yaffe, and I think a lot of you all may have seen this or read about it. It's in the Atlantic, and she sort of says some version of the same exact thing. As a result, those adjudicating sexual assault allegations are told the absence of verbal or physical resistance, the inability to recall crucial parts of an alleged assault, a changing story, none of these factors should raise questions or doubt about a claim. Indeed, all of these behaviors can be considered evidence that an assault occurred. So part of our challenge, I think, is this has become part of the popular narrative, and is to debunk this, is to point out what we're really saying is when someone cannot recall, for instance, crucial details of an act, right, an assault or an alleged assault, we don't immediately jump to they must be lying. That is what, in its essence, being trauma-informed and understanding the neurobiology of trauma is really all about. It doesn't mean, and it's taking it way too far, when we say something along the lines of, this person cannot recall details of what happened to him or her during this night in question, and therefore, it means they must have been sexually assaulted. And I don't know that anybody is actually doing that. But if you were to read the popular narratives out here, both in the Chronicle of Higher Education and in this Emily Yaffe piece, it seems to suggest that the answer is there's at least some folks who think this. We've seen that sort of argument. And by the way, if you're looking for the definitive sort of takedown of the Emily Yaffe Atlantic piece, this is it. It's less publicized, a less publicized response by Dr. Jim Hopper, which is in Psychology Today, and you can find it. It's a very reasoned, thoughtful piece about the neurobiology of trauma and how we are supposed to train on those issues in college campuses. It did not get certainly the number of clicks that the much more provocative piece by Emily Yaffe did receive. What we see, by the way, in the narrative nationally about trauma-informed investigations, we are also starting to see bubble up in the attendant case law as well. And so, long story short, I think we're at a point where historically we're seeing an unprecedented amount of litigation challenging student disciplinary decisions by institutions. Certainly more respondent litigation connected to Title IX investigations now than I think at any point in the history of Title IX, certainly, and the sort of conduct-related litigation that is historically unprecedented. I think there's this wonderful opinion. Some people aren't all that crazy about it, but I think it's a really good opinion, and it's sort of been my go-to opinion, which is Doe versus Purdue University, which just came out of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. It was written by Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who I don't know if you all know was at least under active consideration to be on the Supreme Court. In my opinion, it's the best in the genre in terms of framing the sort of litigation issues that we're seeing over and over again in that respondent litigation. Does a wonderful job of framing the due process issues and when due process is triggered. I won't bore you to tears with all of that. But specifically, it also frames really well, I think, these erroneous outcome claims that we're seeing over and over again. And so I'll just read this. The bottom part. Do the alleged facts, if true, raise a plausible inference that the university discriminated against John on the basis of sex? And so what we're seeing lawyers start to do with regard to trauma-informed techniques is, in essence, argue that those sort of techniques are proxies, in essence, for discrimination on the basis of sex and proxies for discrimination against men. Seeing that, at least from my standpoint, in complaints that are being filed now, that has been one of the factual allegations that I'm seeing more and more often. So I thought it would be nice, at least, to take a look at what courts are saying about that argument, number one, and then lay out what I think is, if we're going to engage in trauma-informed techniques, which I think we should be, what is the solid ground that we can stake out from a litigation perspective? And I'll talk about that in a moment. So there's one case, this is in the Southern District of Iowa, that I was able to find where a court specifically addresses this argument head on. The respondent's argument that the university's use of trauma-informed practices, in essence, was a basis for discriminating against him in a Title IX case. And that case is Rossley versus Drake University. I've put the site in here. This is one of these cases that has attracted the attention of the culture warriors, and there's an interesting piece about this case, or tons of interesting pieces about this case that you can find online. With respect to the argument about trauma-informed investigations, the plaintiff, in essence, argued that the institution as a whole, because it was victim-centered, was really against male respondents. And the argument he used was that there was evidence that most of the claims of sexual misconduct at the university were brought by a female complainant against a male respondent, and therefore this victim-centered approach, or a trauma-informed approach, is in essence a form of discrimination on the basis of sex. Went on, the allegations went on, basically arguing that all of this is designed to protect females on campus in an attempt to convince everybody else that we are fair to sex assault victims on campus, because we were getting all of this pressure from the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. So that's in essence what the argument was. And in this case, the university moved for a summary judgment, basically arguing in essence, that this evidence that a university uses a trauma-informed approach or a victim-centered approach is not discrimination on the basis of sex. And at least in this case, the Southern District of Iowa came back and said, we agree. And you see some of the quotes here. The court, and I'll go to that second one, plaintiff cannot show that trauma-based theories used by defendants were used because plaintiff is a man. So if you read more, and I don't have a ton of time to talk about this case, if you read more into this, what you will see is a concern about, if we're going to use trauma-informed practices, that we are using them consistently with complainants, regardless of sex. And also that a victim-centered approach is not per se discrimination on the basis of sex. This is the one case that I was able to find which directly addresses the issue of trauma-informed practices and whether or not they can serve as the basis for a Title IX discrimination case in a respondent piece of litigation. And at least according to this fairly conservative court, they said no. we see, I found there's one other, let's see if I can get it. There we go. So there's this really interesting case out at Colorado, University of Colorado Boulder involving William Morris. This was a guy that was criminally prosecuted and ultimately, I think, expelled from the university, but acquitted criminally. And this is another one where the attorney, and I think it was Andrew Miltenberg in this one, argued that the incorporation of trauma-informed approaches reflects bias against males in the university process. And the court, the university filed what's called a motion to dismiss, which is not a motion for summary judgment. It's a little earlier on in the process. And it's a little more difficult for universities to win these motions, especially now. And long story short, the court ended up denying the University of Colorado's motion to dismiss, although they didn't really focus so much on the trauma-informed piece of this. There were a lot of factors that Miltenberg was able to cite to, which suggested, yes, there's enough articulable facts here to move forward with a erroneous outcome claim against the university. Now, it's worth pointing out that there was an earlier case in 2017 where the focus was more fully on the trauma-informed approaches, and the district court, the same judge, in fact, said, look, having a trauma-informed approach standing by itself is not a proxy for sex discrimination. It's not enough to demonstrate sex discrimination. So here are the four things, and I want to try to stay on time here, where from a legal standpoint, I think if we do these four things, we're on legally solid ground. The first one is that when we talk about trauma-informed approaches, I love the way Russell Strand sort of forms this. It's, at first, we get out of the way, we shut up, and we let the complainant, that's what Russell Strand is focused on, tell his or her account of what happened. All right, we get out of the way and we shut up. Well, we can do the same sort of interview techniques for respondents as well. And so to the extent we use those techniques, the trauma-informed techniques on complainants and respondents, and you heard Chantelle talking about eye contact and care and all that sort of stuff. To the extent we do that with both complainants and respondents, we're being both trauma-informed and certainly minimizing the risk of any possible argument that we're treating men or respondents in our process in a disparate fashion. I loved what Chantelle said about interviewing for clarification. One of the major problems and critiques of the work that you all do on campuses, and I'm involved with lawyers who critique your performance, is that sometimes you're just serving as glorified stenographers. I'm just listening to what someone says, and when there are obvious holes in an account, I'm not interviewing for clarification. I'm not following up because I'm afraid maybe of re-traumatizing or whatever the case may be. But you have to understand, even in a trauma-informed approach, to do a thorough, thoughtful investigation, there may be some holes that we need to fill in. And so we do that by interviewing for clarification. And I love the way Chantelle framed the way she does it. Are you able? Can you share with me this or fill in the blank? I'll let her do that as well. But that's super important. That when there are gaps, and there may be gaps, that we try to fill those gaps through interviewing for clarification. 3 is really understanding what being trauma-informed means. And again, you see the narrative that's being foisted out there about this technique, which is if someone can't recall details, that's evidence that they have been assaulted. And that's nonsense. That is wrong. If that's your approach here, you're doing it wrong. Being trauma-informed means that different people respond to trauma in different ways. Some people present a certain way that's very flat and is not your quintessential victim. Some people cannot recall details. And what being trauma-informed in essence means is we don't immediately jump to the conclusion that because they're presenting flat or they can't recall a detail, that they must be lying. That's what being truly trauma-informed means. last part, number 4, is that regardless of who, if we're doing number 1, and we're treating complainants and respondents from an investigatory and an interview standpoint the same way, number 4 should be pretty easy to comply with. Regardless of who the complainant is, male, female, that we handle the case in a trauma-informed way, that we treat both, sexes in a non-discriminatory way. So when we do these 4 things, I think from a legal standpoint, we're on really solid ground. And I'm 2 minutes over. I'm sorry, Steve.
That's okay, Scott. I appreciate it. I'm going to go back to Mark Felsheim's question that came up during Chantelle's break that we didn't get a chance to talk about. How much consideration should be given to the gender of the interviewer? And Chantelle, let me give that back to you.
I don't know that there should be any consideration given to the gender of the interviewer. If the interviewer is experienced, if they have the education and training necessary to conduct an interview or an investigation of this kind, then their gender is not relevant. Except when somebody says to you, an interviewee says, I would be more comfortable with a person of a particular gender or gender identity. But I don't think that we have to, we should, and when I say I don't think, I want to be a little bit, I guess, more direct. I don't think it is appropriate for us to assume that only women can interview women or only men can interview men. And so I don't know how relevant it is. I don't know if Scott or Sam want to chime in on that.
Chantelle, this is Scott. I agree with you wholeheartedly. If it is a real stumbling block for the institution to get information, in other words, someone absolutely will not meet with an investigator because they're male or female, it's an issue we'd have to navigate through. But generally speaking, it's not something I'm comfortable entertaining unless, it's an extraordinary circumstance.
Sam?
Yeah, I think that's all pretty sensible advice. There are, of course, circumstances where, people have a genuine sense of discomfort with, say, talking to a middle-aged person of a certain gender about, something really difficult because, they just had never had that conversation with someone of that gender. And I think that there's some value in the rapport-building stage of an interview if we ask a kind of open-ended question about, before we get started, is there anything that you can help me understand that would make you feel a little bit more comfortable talking before we get going. If you ask a kind of open-ended question like that and someone says, well, I really would be more comfortable talking with, a woman or a man or whatever it might be, that is, I think, worth accommodating if it is going to be, as Scott said, a big stumbling block. But I think the second we start making assumptions about it ahead of time, then we might really have a problem of resource allocation, and we might miss the possibility that a particular interviewer just really kind of is very effective with a particular interviewee. And so asking some kind of question in an open-ended way seems fine to me, but making assumptions ahead of time doesn't seem like a good idea.
Scott, Chris Taylor asks, does VAWA require that trauma-informed training or practices occur? And then Taylor Neal says, in addition, when schools are required by funders to use, he puts in quotes, gender-based violence, unquotes, terminology, how would that impact cases such as these?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Chantelle, if do you want to chip in on the second one, because I'm not 100% sure I understand that one. The first one is, and I could be wrong about this, it's been a while, but I was under the impression that, yes, VAWA chipped in on this. I cannot remember, though, for the life of me. if it required us to engage in trauma-informed approaches or encouraged us. I'm thinking it's required, but I'm not 100% sure. Chantelle, Sam, do you want to save me on that one?
Well, I'd certainly like to weigh in a little bit on what I think the second part of the question is, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I do think that it's a question of where your funders are requiring you to change your language and what specifically they're requiring you to change it to. I don't want to address a kind of exaggerated version of your question, so please correct me if I am, but one of the things that I run into as an educator who is talking to people about Title IX and resources available on campus is that I actually work really hard to describe lots of these issues in a gender-neutral way, because I want to make sure that we are leaving space for, say, a trans survivor of violence to seek, help from our counseling center, or that we make it clear that we are thinking about gender in a deliberate enough way that a cisgender man who is, feels some stigma about reporting sexual violence nonetheless feels like they can come talk to us. But there is nothing about that kind of gender-neutral language that to me means we have to eschew, basic realities of the serious study of this kind of violence, which does suggest that there are gender dynamics that matter here. And I don't think that having, say, classes about this or educational programs about this that have, that talk about some gender-specific violence should necessarily be a problem. So the question is about, can we ever use this kind of language? And I would say, well, yeah, I think in the right context, sure. But if your funders for some reason are demanding that you use gendered language when you're talking about people in your process, like, complainant or reporting party or respondent, then I would say that's too far, and that we need to be able to describe our process in terms that are as value neutral as we can.
We have a helpful follow-up from Dano with respect to the VAWA part of the question. He or she quotes VAWA as saying, be conducted by officials who receive annual training on the issues related to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and how to conduct an investigation and hearing process that protects the safety of victims and promotes accountability.
Yeah, and right, exactly. There's no explicit mention of trauma-informed techniques in the regs as far as I am aware of. The question is whether or not, in essence, that was a cryptic way of, in essence, requiring those sorts of techniques. So there's nothing specific, and specifically the reliance on stereotypes about victims' behavior is, I think, is that basically a proxy for some sort of trauma-informed approach?
Thanks, Dano, and thanks, Scott. Sam, we're going to turn it over to you. We're not going to lose the questions. We've got another break coming on, but we need to give Sam his time.
Okay. Thank you very much. So one thing that I often think is helpful to just check in with is what are some broad principles that we can follow when we are designing not only an investigative process, but also a good approach to prevention, or a good way to describe to our faculty and staff what their obligations are, what the resources are. And the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, has a list that I find myself returning to over and over and over again, and I think it is a helpful kind of lodestar for us. So, when we consider principles of a trauma-informed approach, obviously that's going to be something that prioritizes safety. And this is something that can appear in lots of different ways. But one of the, my favorite examples, because I think it's really clear, is let's say we are, in a case where we have someone who's reported being in an abusive relationship, and they are interested in cutting ties with the respondent, in getting interim measures like emergency housing, and also potentially in getting a no-contact directive, which is what we call it on our campus. Well, obviously, if we were going to talk to respondent and institute that interim measure, we have to recognize that that could be a flashpoint for potential retaliation. So a way that we might prioritize safety is to say, here is the date and time that we're going to, talk to respondent about, this no contact directive, and it may be that complainant wants to adjust in some way, that maybe they want to stay with a friend or visit their parents for the weekend, or do things that they think will help them feel safer in a time that for them feels higher risk. It is also obviously important that any kind of action that we take is going to keep respondent safety in mind whenever that feels particularly relevant or at risk. One of the next principles here is trustworthiness and transparency. This is where, when Chantelle was talking about, doing some expectation setting about how the Title IX process works is so important. Explaining even little things like, here is why sometimes I'm going to be okay with silence, is that I know these things can be hard to talk about, and I want to give you the time that you need to say what you need to say. I don't want to interrupt you too much. That kind of explanation can feel rote or even strange in the moment, but it has to do with being transparent about how we might interview any of the parties, including respondents. Another principle here is peer support. This is something we identified on our own campus, is can we work with our counseling center to have, say, support groups that could be helpful. And this is why a lot of times prevention events can be a really important or rich experience for people who realize that they are, not alone. Right? Collaboration and mutuality wherever that is possible. So again, to use an example of a no-contact directive, if we have two students who are both in our, our engineering department, and we want to work with both of them to make sure that a no-contact directive is planned out effectively and so that it provides minimal inconvenience to both parties. We might also be on a smaller campus where maybe there's only one place to eat lunch. And so we want to make sure that we plan out, so who is going to be eating lunch and at what time. Doing that sort of mapping with a no-contact directive can be really the difference between a successful and unsuccessful interim measure. The next principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. So part of my rapport building, and I actually do this with anyone I'm talking to. If I'm talking to a complainant or a respondent, I tend to ask permission for things a lot in the early going, the rapport building stage. So I might ask permission for something like, is it all right if I sit in this chair, right? And it is a simple way especially for someone who might feel as if things are completely out of control or as if someone has tried to take control from them in an act of violence. It can be a really easy way to just let them make a choice in our process. If you're not comfortable with me sitting right across from you, maybe I can go sit at the head of the table or somewhere else. But those kinds of things sound small. They are, in fact, not. And we'll talk about this sixth principle a lot when we're talking about prevention efforts. But I think it's really, really important that we not talk about this issue as if all people affected by stalking or intimate partner violence or sexual assault or image-based sexual abuse or whatever we're talking about, that they all are this kind of generalized person with no gender, no race, no culture, no ethnicity. That to me is a recipe for a tone-deaf prevention approach for some reasons that we're going to discuss later. And it may also be something that we consider in the same way that social workers might consider basic cultural competency when they are working with a client. we're not doing therapy. We are doing an investigative interview, but it is nonetheless critical that people feel comfortable enough to talk to us about some pretty difficult stuff. That's just a big part of our job. And so, any kind of in-service training that you can do with your investigative staff, with the people on your hearing boards, I think this is a valuable addition to that. So if that's going to be sort of what's in the background here, I think it's important for a second that we talk about prevention. And I recognize that many Title IX administrators in the audience here may have a separate office that does prevention, and it's not in their shop. And there are some good reasons to have that kind of model, and I'm not necessarily here to critique it. But what I would say is that if the Title IX office is not a visible presence in some of these events about things like intimate partner violence or sexual assault, that is a real missed opportunity. And I say that as a person who runs lots of these events and who at my institution is what we would call an anonymous resource. So I help staff a hotline that people can call or text 24 hours a day. They can ask us questions about their process, and we don't even ask what their name is. So we have a kind of a separate system for folks who are not sure what they want to do. Oftentimes, when I do prevention events, people will come up to me afterwards and disclose. That's a really common experience. And you also tend to see some of the same people at a lot of these events, which means that our absence as a Title IX office is conspicuous. So I would encourage us to be involved in one way or another. There ought not to be anything biased or partisan about the idea that we want to prevent violence from occurring on our college campuses. And if somebody wants to have that argument, with me on my campus, I'm generally delighted to have it because it's not a sensible thing to argue. But it's worth mentioning, of course, that not all prevention is the same. And as these regulations change, the kinds of resources that we throw in the direction of these efforts might be one of the things that we really still have a whole lot of control over. And so I just want to make some distinctions here. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that preventative efforts that show some effect are high dosage, meaning that they don't tend to be like 1 hour with our first-year students and then we never see them again, but they might be multiple sessions of the same class that occur over a couple of weeks. I recognize that provides a resource problem, but I think articulating that to our administration is part of our job, right? That doing effective prevention is very difficult. It requires a lot of resources. Doing window dressing really requires a lot less. But again, looking for the ceiling and not the floor is part of what we're doing here. You may have lots of other partners on your campus who are engaged in this work, and so we want to make sure we're working with them in a cooperative way. And then, as I referenced before, we want to make sure our way of talking about this is intersectional, so we're not pretending as if, say, a person of color would have exactly the same level of comfort talking to the police about sexual violence. Same might be true, by the way, for a person with a disability whose only experience with the police might have been when they were being, say, taken to a hospital against their will in some kind of commitment proceeding. We also want to make sure that we're observing cultural differences in how someone might feel comfortable talking about this issue. And so if we're having a kind of open forum where there's a bunch of students present, there might be some who are comfortable engaging with these issues, like, what is consent, for example, but there might be others for whom more discreet setting is helpful. So again, when you talk about sexual assault prevention as if people affected by these issues, or intimate partner violence prevention, any kind of prevention effort, if you talk about people who have been affected by these issues as if they have no other identities, then you miss a lot of the other related oppression that they may have experienced, and you may inadvertently increase distrust in your system. One thing we know is that when we have good prevention, reports go up. That has been the case on our campus for quite some time, and it's worth maybe unpacking some of the reason why. This is where maybe talking about some of the realities of how trauma can affect our behavior really does matter. When I'm talking to students or faculty or staff about, okay, if you were going to an emergency room and you were going to meet with a trauma survivor, what sorts of behaviors or affect or demeanor would you expect? It tends to be a really helpful discussion, but of course the question is kind of a trick question because we would expect to see a variety of emotional presentations. And this matters when we're doing our secondary prevention a great deal, because a secondary prevention isn't about necessarily changing behavior and reducing violence. It's about trying to tell people what resources are available to them in the event that they need help on our campuses. And so it really matters that we start talking about some of the realities of trauma survivors, and I'd like to demonstrate an example of why that might be. The video we're going to watch here is from a 2016 newscast, I believe, in the Houston area of a flood that was happening there. And in this newscast, while a live broadcast is going on, a person who did not realize how deep the water was attempted to drive through it with his car. What happened next, and we're going to watch it with the sound off, I'm going to kind of narrate it for you, but is the anchor ends up asking the person, hey, you've got to leave your car, right? And what you'll see is the person lean their head outside the door and look very confused. At one point they ask things like, I don't know what to do, should I stay in the car, even as it is sinking. And the question here is, when we watch this behavior, what do we see? So Steve, if you could go ahead and start the video for us, that would be wonderful. Okay, so here you can see the car is sinking. You can see the gentleman on camera step out, and here he's asking what to do. He's having a hard time actually hearing the instructions, even though they're simple and shouted. He asks for repetition many times, and then finally he does get out to swim. Now, it's very deep where he is, not as deep where you're about to see this reporter walk out to meet him. But I want you to watch the behavior of this person who's just exited this vehicle. I want you to observe little things like his gait. At one point he says to the reporter, my car is under. And the camera pans over to the car, which is sinking ever faster. And the look of shock on his face here is unmistakable. You can see his car sinking there. And even an awareness of the fact that there's a camera here seems to be sort of lacking. You can see him walk straight out through the shot. You can see him stumbling, stunned. And as he's being shepherded out by this reporter, he's walking right in front of the camera. Now, the question when I'm showing this video to a group of students or to faculty or staff who might end up, getting a request for help from a member of our community, the question that I want to ask here is, when you watch this video, what do you see? In part, it's a product of what you choose to see and how you, how much complexity and nuance you choose to allow into your understanding of this person's behavior. And I know we might think we're all really good at this, but I think that we should pause for a second and consider how in the nuanced and compassionate world of the internet, commenters might have responded to this same video. So you can see here some of the comments, and these are some of the tamer ones that I pulled. Some people saying this is the Darwin Awards, implying, of course, that because this person is stupid, that they maybe even deserve to die. It doesn't seem like he's crashed the car. It seems like he's drunk. Why is he acting drunk? This is a person who maybe doesn't have a frame of reference for understanding how this might change our behavior. Someone else mentioning natural selection, another person poking fun at this scared gentleman's inability to follow seemingly simple instructions. This is what I think of when I think of who might students on my campus or staff members on my campus go to for help. This is what the general public thinks. And so a trauma-informed part of our prevention is also really important here. So again, the question here is when you look at this person and their behavior, what is it that you see? It's not that you can look at their behavior and immediately conclude that everything about their story is true and accurate. It's not that you can use that as proof positive that one thing happened or another didn't. It's that you understand this behavior is consistent with a survivor of trauma and that you are not going to fault him for it. Examples like this have huge value when we are doing trainings for folks outside of our office. So I know we're a few minutes behind, but I just want to emphasize the importance of collaborating with outside agencies. And this is something, again, we can do in any regulatory environment. Does Title IX have a presence on the local SART team, for example, or you might use a different acronym. It might be an MDT, for example. Are we reaching out to populations who we know are both more vulnerable than a general population and also less likely to seek services? So are we doing specific programming with organizations that represent people of color or LGBTQIA folks? This is a really good example because just recently we designated our LGBTQ+ Center as a place where folks are not mandatory reporters. And that was a policy change we decided to make in large part because we were, having folks who are in the LGBTQIA community who felt more comfortable going to that center and having kind of preliminary discussions and would simply talk to no one if those discussions would be reported to some administrator that they didn't know or didn't trust. So that was a change we decided to make at WVU. Now, another example of working across the lines of agency had to do with a project we did with our local police. The Morgantown Police Department worked together with the prosecutor's office and with our office as well to take a long, hard look at the environment in which we do interviews. And you all know the sort of stereotypical arrangement of an interview room or an interrogation room that is deliberately sort of cold and intimidating. What we ended up doing is soliciting donations from local businesses, and this is what we created together in the Morgantown Police Department. This is the Judy King soft interview room, and this is an actual room in our police department. We were part of being trauma-informed meant considering where is it that we have these interviews, how do we build rapport, how do we make people more comfortable. So just as a final thought here, evaluating what we're already doing really matters, and that might mean looking at things like are our reporting options accessible? Is our complaint form accessible? On our website, does it say things like, to file a complaint, click here, and the only hyperlink is the word here? If that's the case, that's not accessible to someone who uses a screen reader. So we want to be working really closely with our Centers for Independent Living or with our ADA staff about really reviewing those kinds of things. And just as an example of a good change that can happen, if we're ready to solicit feedback about how other people feel going through our process, I want to provide an example. We use an interim measure called a traumatic incident letter, which is a letter that goes out to all of the students' professors, and it's very vague. It says, look, something difficult has happened in this student's life. Please provide reasonable academic accommodations. It actually goes through another office on our campus, in part because we don't necessarily want to indicate that this is necessarily a Title IX related issue. Maybe it's a tragedy in the family or a medical emergency. We got some feedback from someone in our process who said, my letter worked fine. It was really helpful as I was going through this process to have academic accommodations, but I had, I think, a well-meaning professor who came up to me after they received the letter and said, oh my gosh, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? What happened? Now, that question, while uttered, I think, in good faith, made this student feel as if in order to get academic accommodations during the investigation, they had to kind of bare their soul to a professor who they liked, but they didn't necessarily have that level of rapport with. So working in conjunction with this person, soliciting their feedback, we added some language to our traumatic incident letter, and you can see it on the slide there. We think this is exactly the sort of thing that because emotions are running high during our process, we sometimes feel like we can't do, but actually asking people what they thought of the process, what kinds of things we might be able to improve in good faith means that, sure, we're going to get some chaff, but we're also going to get a lot of wheat. And I think it is worth soliciting that feedback in a structured way, even if the response rate to say, a survey question or something wouldn't be that high. So again, just as a final reminder, checking in with our existing processes and asking ourselves, do they comport with general ideas of what a trauma-informed process might be? Are we treating both complainants and respondents as humanely as possible while we render a decision in whatever form that takes at our institution? Those questions are not questions that can be answered once. They're questions that have to be returned to again and again, and that is something that we can do in any regulatory environment. So I know that we're going to leave some time for questions here, so I want to open up the floor, and unless I'm missing something, Steve, is that where we're headed next?
That's where we're heading next. Thanks, Sam. I want to let everybody know that our folks who are monitoring Twitter picked up a comment from someone who announced to their followers that they were participating in this webinar and saying remaining trauma-informed in an era, they then named the webinar saying, very helpful to see the learning from case law in the USA in applying trauma-informed approaches. It's like looking into the future for responses we will soon see in the UK. So we're hitting an international audience, apparently. Laura Nelson wonders, what happens if a professor denies accommodations?
Oh, well, that may be institution-specific. So just like Scott said, we want to make sure that we're following our policy to the T. For us, the response is informal. So what our traumatic incident letter says is that a professor is obligated to provide reasonable accommodations. But of course, deciding what is reasonable is a subjective question, and one where the professor has substantial purview. So do we have someone who maybe because of stalking has been not going to class because they're afraid of running into their stalker? Can we get those absences excused? Well, I mean, that sounds like a very reasonable accommodation. When we've had professors who were resistant to that, which I should say to our great credit at WVU has happened extremely rarely, we have often, with the party's permission, been able to talk to that professor informally and resolve the issue by just explaining our general expectation. This is what we think is best as far as our policy goes, and we've never had to push it much farther. I would be actually really interested to hear if if anyone else has had the experience of actually having to engage some policy process. But generally, our professors have been really reasonable and helpful in this regard.
And Chantelle and Scott, before you reply, let me pass on a follow-up that came in the chat. Clarissa Humphrey is wondering whether traumatic incident letters are unique to your institution, referring to yours, Sam, or are they used more widely? So, Chantelle, as you comment on the issue, perhaps say whether there are such letters at Cornell.
Yeah, so we absolutely use letters that are similar. We don't call it what Sam's calling it, but we have the same process here at Cornell. And I also worked in the SUNY system, and same process at most of the 64 campuses in the State University of New York system. And I think what I have seen is exactly what Sam is describing. Those letters don't come directly from the Office of the Title IX coordinator. They're vague. The well-written letters, like Sam displayed, include a recommendation that the professor not pry into the reason for the letter being issued. And at Cornell, and also when I was at the University at Albany, we very rarely, very, very rarely had any pushback from faculty. And when we did, we would work with either the dean or the department chair to work back with the professor, and it never had to go further than that. I'd also say that one of the things that we do here at Cornell and that we did at the University at Albany was really proactively engage our faculty and staff on the role of our office and what we do insofar as not just investigating, because I think that most folks, when they hear Title IX office, they think it's an office that is just focused on investigating and adjudicating and disciplining folks. And I think sometimes what's lost is that really our main function, more often than not, is to ensure that folks who've experienced violence are being provided with support and resources so that they can continue to excel and succeed in the academic setting. And so when we really make it a point to engage in person, one-on-one with members of faculty. We call it our little Title IX tour. We go from department to department and college to college. We go to department meetings, and we spend as much time as they'll give us, whether that's 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and we talk about what we do, and we always talk about academic accommodations. And we say, at some point, you may receive a letter, and it's going to be vague, and that might be from us. It might be from Disability Services. It might be from Cornell Health, writing a letter on behalf of a student who has a medical issue that they're facing. When you receive these letters, please know that we don't just kind of hand them out, right? So we're cognizant and we're mindful, and we're being intentional when we grant a student a letter in which academic accommodations are being sought. And being proactive in that way with our faculty has really gone a long way, and then being accepting of those letters and respectful of the students that are the beneficiaries of those letters.
Chantelle, you've implicitly answered a question from Laura Nelson, who wonders what office would you suggest issues these academic accommodation emails to professors. You've mentioned a number of offices that do so at Cornell. Sam, where do they come from at WVU?
For us, it's the Office of Student Life. And we think that really works for us because, again, if this was a student who had a protracted medical emergency, the same letter would go out. If this was a student who had a family tragedy and had to go home, across the country or out of the country to seek, or to grieve for the loss of a family member, the same letter might go out. And so the more that you can, sort of aggregate the various needs for academic accommodations, the more cover that gives to a complainant or respondent who is getting academic accommodations, and that it doesn't, you don't want a system where it's just clear that this is a Title IX letter. You want to provide another office, I think.
We only have a few seconds left, but there was a long conversation about mutual no-contact orders, and I'm going to summarize it and ask just one of you to comment. I'm sorry, because we don't have time for all three. But Nicole Johnson kicked it off saying, are mutual no-contact orders best practice? I've read mixed guidance on this issue. Clarissa Humphrey said, good question. We use mutual no-contact arrangements as non-judgmental precautionary measures during investigations, and then unilateral no-contact orders as sanctions if required. Hoping to get advice on this. Chantelle, let me kick it over to you. You've probably been reading the chat, or one of you dive in on mutual no-contacts.
I will chip in.
That's Scott, yes?
Chantelle. Yes, this is Scott. My view on this has evolved a little bit. I used to think it was, hey, just go out and that was sort of a reflex, mutual no-contact letters. There's been some, first of all, the no-contact letters, especially at smaller institutions, raise a whole host of very difficult practical issues about inadvertent contact on small campuses. So if you're going to issue them, I think there need to be some really clear guide rules about, well, what happens if you're both at the same place and one person comes in first and all that sort of stuff. Very clear guide rules, more detail than I'm used to seeing with no contact letters. The second thing is, and this is bubbled up in some of the case law, is we issue the no contact letter, but don't really do anything to meaningfully enforce it in the instances where it is being violated. And there have been some cases suggesting that that is an act of deliberate indifference under Title IX. So a couple of things. If you're going, I've become a fan of it. We obviously need to consider them. I've become a bigger fan of them being a little more detailed in terms of what happens in certain situations that come up over and over again. And if we're going to issue them, we need to be prepared to follow up with students and ultimately discipline students who continue to not comply with them.
Thanks very much, Chantelle, Scott, and Sam, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page in the next week or so for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker's slides. The brief evaluation survey I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. We're only a few weeks away from the annual Legal Issues in Higher Education Conference sponsored by one of our partner organizations, the University of Vermont. The conference features leading experts in higher education law, student affairs, and campus public safety. The conference spans 2.5 days from October 14th to 16th, and you can attend in person or online. The registration link on your screen is clickable, and I'll bring that slide back in a moment. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young, Dan Cardella, and Jordan Dianetti. This is Steve Worona. Thank you for joining us today on Campus Public Safety Online.